That would have been so sad if I forgot. So, hi, folks. Welcome to week 3 of this, whatever you want to call this. We're going to have some fun. As a quick warning, this presentation is well over 300 slides long. So there is a non-zero chance we go a tiny bit over, although most of it is examples. So it's not that intense. There's just a decent chance that we run the teeniest, weentiest bit over time, which I apologize for well in advance. So the gist of what we're going to be covering tonight is argumentation, refutation, and weighing. And I'll sort of integrate some general strategy advice into all of that. As a quick note, this is generic to any style of debate, parley, BP, any sort of other ugly, awful, horrible format that no human being should ever be forced to do. Oh, world schools. That's the world schools as well. World schools is fun. Are there any other good styles of debate that I'm forgetting about that I need to mention? CP, I guess. Anything else I missed? I don't think so. Anyways, the gist of what we're going to cover is like strategy for going through those types of things, etc. But before that, 2 quick things I want to get out of the way. The first thing is, in case you're new to this or haven't been here in the past, hello, please feel free to participate and be welcome. Like, I don't want this to be me just like talking at you. There's going to be a bunch of opportunities for people to jump in and interject and say stuff. So please feel free to jump in and interject and say stuff. Second thing, in case at any point randomly there's just like a blurry section of my screen, it just means I'm checking chat or I have participants tab open. It's not like I'm randomly trying to block some part of the presentation from you. I do promise very much. You'll just have to accept that I'm actually not trying to deliberately like screen block you. Second thing is I'm going to talk about a decent bit of stuff tonight, but I want to be clear on the big picture advice of what I'm going to end up saying. And the big picture basically is just that bad debating is very, very similar to those dairy-free, gluten-free, vegan dessert recipes. And to be clear, I have nothing against like being dairy-free or gluten-free or vegan, which we definitely all should be doing. But here's what I mean. When you have a recipe that's like this or whatever, it's totally fine. Wonderful. I love it. Great. Have some vegan chocolate chip cookies. Amazing. That's wonderful. But there are 2 things that really irritate me about these recipes. The first is, do not lie. Like, do you guys ever read those recipes that are like, how to make a gluten-free chocolate chip cookie? It'll taste just as good as anything else. And then it like, no, it's not. Like, I love it. Tell me how to make a vegan brownie, but don't tell me it's going to taste as good as the non-vegan stuff, because it just doesn't. So the first general thing I'm going to comment on tonight is just whenever you're making refutations, arguments, weighing, just be honest about it. Like, it's much better to make an argument that claims that you got a kind of decently certain but small impact, as opposed to try to impact out to some really persuasive sounding thing, but the underlying mechanisms aren't sound. The second thing, and admittedly this isn't just true of vegan recipes, it's true of all recipes, is the trend of like people being like, let me tell you how to make this recipe. But before I do that, let me tell you my entire life story in 17,000 words. Like, don't do that. I mean, you can in recipes, it just is annoying. And also, you should not do that in debate speeches. Now, I don't just mean don't have excessively long intros. What I more specifically mean, and I will talk more about this later on, is like the more that you can front load stuff in debate, the better. So the biggest issue that a lot of debaters run into, I think, in my opinion, is that they let the debate play out too slowly. So just by like a show of either words in chat or someone saying out loud, has anyone here ever debated this house would raise the minimum wage? Has seriously no one ever debated this house would raise the minimum wage?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So presumably some of you, all of you, most of you, 110,000% of you have debated that motion. Whenever you watch people debate it, even people who've debated it in the past, the debate always goes the same thing. Gov stands up and they're like, it would be great if we paid poor people more money. And then Op stands up and they're like, but prices are going to go up. And then the second Gov speaker is like, well, let me give you some responses to prices. And then the second Op speaker is like, well, let me respond to that analysis. And then boom, you've gone through 4 entire speeches. And everyone knew what was going to happen. No one came into the debate. No second Gov speaker in the entire world would be shocked at the idea that you're going to hear an argument from Op about, oh my gosh, prices are going to go up. So the sooner that you can accelerate the pace of debates, the better. So the more that in a first speech, you can be like, look, we all know opposition is going to say X thing. Let me just deal with X thing now. The better you can do that, the sooner. So TLDR, do not be like vegan chocolate chip cookie recipes. Being a vegan chocolate chip cookie is totally fine. Just don't be like the recipe, because that would be really sad. I also apologize if anyone here really, really likes vegan chocolate chip cookies. If so, I apologize for offending you terribly. Did I offend anyone terribly? If so, please tell me so that I do not offend you more. Just kidding. I'm not going to talk anymore about vegan chocolate chip cookies. First thing tonight, argument generation. Oh, I lied. I totally lied on the structure. First thing we're going to talk about is argument generation and all these other things. Oopsies. Slideshow mess up. Oopsies. Okay. Argument generation. We're going to talk about 8, but it's really 9 strategies because I added in a 9th just for funsies because I think you guys deserve these. So quick note is that as I go through this, there's going to be a bunch of examples. Some of them I'm going to ask rhetorical questions. Some of them I'm actually going to ask real questions. Like, I mean this very honestly when I say, like, hang on, I will come off screen share to say this to your faces. Like, please feel free to unmute and talk and chat. Otherwise, this will be very painful and very boring and very sad. And I don't think anyone likes any of those things. And if you do, that's unfortunate. So 9 strategies. We'll go through all of them. Strategy number 1 is basically just talking about stakeholders. This is probably something most of you have been exposed to or have thought about and or have done in debates, but we'll blitz through anyways. What is a stakeholder? It's basically just someone who's holding a medium rare filet mignon. Just kidding. It is someone who is affected in some way, shape, or form by a debate. You can think of stakeholders in a few different ways. You can think of them geographically. So where does this debate take place? What about different types of governments, different types of countries? Does this take place in post-colonial countries? Does this take place in post-conflict societies? Does this take place in emerging democracies? You can also think about stakeholders in terms of who is implementing the motion, governments, activists, corporations, but you can also think about who is being targeted by the motion. So if you have this house would break up large banks, you know that obviously Wall Street or large financial institutions is the target of that motion, and it is being implemented by a different actor, like, for example, a regulatory body like the SEC. The other thing that I think is very useful when thinking about stakeholder analysis is you want to be nuanced in terms of thinking about different subgroups. So for example, if you have a politics motion, guess who's affected by most politics motions? That's right, to the fake hypothetical person I'm pointing to right now for $1 million, voters are affected by politics motions. But like, there's no just like one type of voter, there's many different types of voters. And to the extent that there are many different types of voters, it's worth thinking about, how does this affect independent voters? How does this affect undecided voters? How does this affect Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, Tories, blah, blah, blah. In terms of coming up with who's affected by a topic, that's step number 1. Who is impacted? Who holds a stake? Who's going to be like affected in some way? After you figured out who is affected by a topic, it's then also quite useful to do 2 things. A is to step back and to ask yourself, what characterizes this stakeholder? So what are their interests? What do they want? How do they get to the position where they're in right now? And then secondly, you want to use that characterization to attempt to analyze how a stakeholder is likely to respond to some sort of motion. So for example, if a policy affects corporations, you might ask a question like, what is the incentive of a corporation? You might figure out, oh, it's probably to make money. And then you could use that profit incentive analysis to analyze how a company would respond to a motion. And you could, of course, generalize this to any stakeholder. What are their interests, or what is their nature? And how does that affect the way they're going to respond to this motion? So easiest way that we're going to do this is to blitz through a couple of examples. So this house believes the US should publicly extend an ironclad guarantee of defense to Taiwan. Even if you knew literally no terms in this motion, you would probably be able to figure out at least some of the groups who are affected, like, for example, the United States, like, for example, Taiwan. And maybe if you know a teeny weeny bit of international relations, maybe you know that China is also affected by this. But of course, if you're trying to be nuanced, you might then go a little bit deeper and ask yourself, well, what groups within the US are affected, or Taiwan, or China? And you could start thinking about a broader group of people being affected by this, US allies in the region, different regions within China, like Hong Kong, like Tibet. You might think about different groups within Taiwan, like their semiconductor manufacturer, like separatists, like nationalists, like their current government, like their military. And then you could look at all of these groups, or at least the most important of them, and you could analyze their likely response to this motion. So how does the Belt and Road Initiative change if the United States publicly comes out with a rather strong affront to China and says, we will defend Taiwan? How do US allies in the region, like, for example, Japan or South Korea, respond when the United States very publicly signals its commitment to the region? Take a different motion. This house regrets the expansion of NATO since 1991. Who's affected by the topic? Same thing. Bunch of different groups are, but generally you might say Eastern Europe, existing NATO countries, and Russia are affected by this. And you could do the same exact thing. Break these groups down by subgroups. So what people within Russia are affected by this topic? Because, for example, Putin will not be affected in the same way as Russian allies like China will be affected by this motion. Think about different types of countries within Eastern Europe. What about countries that have been accepted into NATO? What about countries that haven't been accepted into NATO? You can look at all of those groups and then ask yourself the question of how can I attempt to analyze these actors and how might they be impacted in some way, some shape, some form by this motion? We're going to use a couple more examples of this. So let's say you have a motion, this house opposes the rise of girl boss feminism. This is kind of a broad motion, and that's a good example to use because it affects lots of groups. Anyone want to take a stab at, broadly speaking, who this motion might impact in some way, shape, or form? If you want to speak, either unmute or raise your hand on Zoom and I'll call on you.
Women.
Okay, women, perfect,
And men.
Wonderful. Women, men, fantastic. Keep going, folks. Who else is affected by this topic in some way, shape, or form?
Non-binary people.
Non-binary people,
The feminist movement.
feminist movement, and maybe feminists more generally. Yeah, like that's a probably good start, right?
Congress.
Yeah, legislative bodies, right? And you can make it more general, right? Conservatives, men, politicians, companies, women. But then you could, of course, break that down even further, right? So within the feminist movement, for example, what types of feminists might be affected by this? So for example, how does a Marxist feminist react to girl boss feminism? How does a relatively, say, moderate feminist react to this narrative? Within the realm of women, there are many different types of women, obviously. So how does this narrative affect very poor women? How does this narrative affect relatively more privileged women? And then in terms of other groups, companies, governments, politicians, men, how does this affect moderate men? How does this affect relatively regressive or relatively sexist men? So talking about all those groups can help to inform a lot of your analysis. We'll do one more example and then move on. Let's say you have a motion, this House would mandate that in every electoral cycle, no more than 50% of politicians from every major party can rerun for office. Who's affected by this topic in some capacity?
Politicians.
Politicians, fantastic. Give me more. What types of politicians might be affected?
Political parties.
Okay, yeah, parties are affected. Fantastic. Same
Voters.
question there. Voters are affected. Okay, cool. So we've got the main idea, right? Those are basically more or less the ones I came up with, right? I added governments in, but that's kind of redundant. What types of groups are there, though? Let's see if you guys can take the work off me for a second. Like, what types of parties are there? Politicians are there? Voters are there? I mentioned some of this earlier.
Establishment politicians versus more populist politicians.
Yeah, so maybe anti-establishment versus establishment politicians. Fantastic, for sure. Other things that people can think of. And again, maybe you don't know how this connects to the motion, but just shout out ideas like what types of people get impacted in some way by this
Young
motion.
voters.
Young voters, exactly.
Democrats versus Republicans.
Yeah, liberals versus conservatives, exactly. Different ideologically aligned voters. Anyone else that folks want to shout out? That's probably the main ones that you want to cover, right? But like you can talk about lots of different types of institutions here, right? Even within the realm of governments, how does this affect, for example, governments that have a first past the post voting system versus governments that feature more proportional based systems of representation, like parliamentary systems? How does this affect, let's say, for example, very well established and very well entrenched political parties like the ANC in South Africa, versus how does this maybe affect more nascent, or even if they're major parties, relatively less powerful parties like opposition to the AKP in Turkey, for instance? So all of this is basically just to say that you can sort of take motions and sort of brainstorm who's affected by them in some way. We'll skip over this example just for time's sake, but this is, again, another example a bit broader where just analyzing who is affected by the topic is a pretty helpful first step in trying to generate arguments. So the takeaway from the first thing so far we've covered is whenever you have a motion, asking yourself who is impacted by this topic is a very useful way of generating a potential set of people or a potential set of actors who you could maybe possibly subsequently maybe make arguments about. Now, to be clear, the fact that someone is affected by a topic does not auto mean that they are affected by a topic in a good way or in a bad way, depending on whatever side you happen to be on. But the kind of main idea here is just that brainstorming who's affected by a topic, especially when you're stuck in terms of case construction, is a nice first step towards generating arguments. The next thing then becomes, how do you analyze how a topic affects those people? And in order to do that, the best thing to do is to characterize what these stakeholders or what these actors or governments or politicians, what they look like. So what is characterization? In literature, we would say characterization is, the ways in which, for example, a author portrays a character. And in debate, of course, it's a little bit different because characterization takes on a more argumentative role. So in debate, what we're generally talking about, excuse me, vis-a-vis characterization is basically three things. A, what does someone want? Almost all the time, we do things because we want some outcome. So maybe, for example, you study hard in school because you want to get good grades, but you want to get good grades presumably for some reason. Maybe you want like some respect from your teachers or parents or friends. Maybe you want to get into a good college. Maybe you just really hate the way that the letter C looks like it's an unfilled in circle, and that gives you like raging anger problems. The point is, you might have any number of reasons to care about getting good grades, but the underlying characteristic of who you are helps to explain why you want good grades. Maybe it's the fact that you just want to get into a good college. Maybe it's something like pride. So the first thing that characterizes anyone, companies, governments, politicians, activists, literally anything that you can imagine, why do they do certain things? The second thing that characterizes any sort of general actor is what they're able to do. So for example, I'll pick on someone just because, yay, picking on someone, that sounds very fun. Let's say like, who should I pick on? Rory, I'll pick on you. Rory, do you have the ability to solve global hunger right this second?
Absolutely not.
That is so sad. But yes, it's true. Unfortunately, neither do I. Maybe it's the case that you or anyone else in the Zoom call wants to, like maybe we want to feel good about ourselves and solve global hunger, but it's not within our ability to solve global hunger, like fully solve, I mean. So the point is, people want things, but we're also constrained by capacity. In other words, we're constrained by our abilities and by certain limits that we just can't get past. So whenever you think about, well, how is a certain group going to respond to something, you want to think more than just, well, what are the incentives of some group? You also want to think about what is within their power. What can they possibly do? So for example, whenever you analyze the way that a court might respond to emotion, you want to be cognizant of what are the limits on a court's power? Like, what could a court realistically do? Is the only thing a court can do strike down a law, or could they de facto create new legislation through judicial interpretation? So thinking about capacity is often just as helpful as thinking about incentives. Lastly, I think that this tends to be a little bit underanalyzed, but think about why an actor is the way they are. So especially in international relations motions, it can be very helpful to be like the one team that kind of knows something. It can be like, well, this country wants this thing because historically it, for example, emerged under the influence of colonial power structures. Or maybe you, for example, are going to analyze some sort of stakeholder and talk about why their current interests are fairly heavily molded by their history working with a particular corporation. Whatever it happens to be, explaining the backstory of some sort of actor is often a pretty helpful way in predicting how they're going to respond in the future. So for example, we kind of like empirically know that companies might want profit, but they also at the same time care about their reputation to at least some extent, because we know in the past that's how most companies have behaved. That can help inform their future responses to policies or norms or ideas that you debate. So we're going to go through a kind of like exhaustive example of this using this motion, the rise of rainbow capitalism. For those of you that don't know, rainbow capitalism, you can Google rainbow capitalism memes. There's a bunch of really funny memes out there of people making fun of companies, but it's basically on like, especially during Pride Month, a bunch of companies will be like, we are so woke, and they'll run like a bunch of like ads that are like, we love gay people, and they'll run a bunch of like clothes that are like all of a sudden rainbow colored, and then like July 1st they'll like take them all off their website and put them all off the shelves. And rainbow capitalism is basically the rise of companies kind of like exploiting / using, depending on your perspective, queer advocacy to entrench profits. So in terms of looking at this motion, let's say we're governing this motion. The first question you might ask yourself is, who's affected by this topic? And you can come up with a few different types of people. Maybe individual members of the LGBTQ community are affected by this. Companies obviously are affected by this. Governments, voters, politicians, activists, they're all affected. Now, when you want to make arguments, one way that you can potentially do that is to do exactly what we just described. A, who's affected? B, how are they affected? And in order to answer part B, you might want to ask yourself that question of, well, what are their characteristics? So let's start on companies. What do companies want? Someone shouted out. I just said it earlier, so this shouldn't be like horribly hard. Yeah, they want money. They want the money, and that's the biggest thing they probably want. So if companies want money, you can probably make arguments about how companies engage in rainbow capitalism based on that incentive. So maybe, for example, if you want to run some mitigatory analysis, or even if you want to run a more offensive version of this argument, maybe you say if you're a company, you're realistically never going to embrace fairly radical or hardline queer advocacy because that's going to alienate consumers. So just from inference of the fact that companies want to make money, they're probably going to engage in pinkwashing in the context of embracing LGBTQ advocacy, but only to the very moderate extent that a company can portray itself as woke, but they're never really going to push for the real solutions and real policies and norm changes that we need to really eliminate homophobia, transphobia, et cetera, from society. Maybe you focus on a different actor. Maybe you talk about individual members of the LGBTQ community and how different individuals within that group, since it's not a monolith, of course, might internalize or might respond to rainbow capitalism. And this is where things get a little bit more tricky because, again, there's many different subgroups within the queer community. There's different types of individuals, different people struggling with their identities, et cetera. But if you ask the very broad question of, in general, what are some of the interests of individual people who fit within that community, you might come up with a bunch of different answers. People who just want general acceptance, people who want legal protections, people who want access to reproductive rights, et cetera. And from that, in terms of this, what does the group want? You might then also ask questions like, well, how did the group that we're talking about, in this context, the LGBTQ community, get to the place they're currently in? And you can talk about the histories of marginalization, exclusion, victimization, et cetera, that especially corporations have played in sort of creating those historical systems of power and oppression. And so from that, again, you can take arguments, or rather pieces of characterization or incentive analysis, and build arguments out of that on how this might affect individual people within the LGBTQ community. Maybe you want to talk about politicians and parties. I'll make this a little bit faster. But if you're a politician, especially a politician who's actively campaigning, what do you probably want in general?
You want votes?
Yeah, you want votes. Like, you just want people to vote for your party. And that probably means that you can make arguments about what rainbow capitalism does in terms of how you get those votes. So to what extent are you, for example, more or less willing to respond to a company and call them out for their homophobia when you also know at the same time that that company has publicly portrayed itself as being pro-queer? And how might that affect your messaging as a candidate, given that you don't want to alienate either corporations or individual consumers because you want to get votes, you want to get money, et cetera? I'm not going to cover the next three as exhaustively, but the general idea here is identify who's affected by a topic, think about their characteristics, their incentives, their capacities, their history, and you can often base arguments upon that. You can think about that in terms of voters, but again, you can subdivide voters. How do right-wing voters, left-wing voters, allied voters, moderate voters, all these different groups respond to this, and you can make arguments based upon that. So you, for example, could ask, well, what do different types of voters care about? Some of them care about maintaining traditional power hierarchies. Some of them care about expressing public support for a movement. Some of them care about really radically reforming society. And you can make arguments about how certain groups will respond to things like rainbow capitalism on either side. Same thing with activists. What do activists want? What do, for example, governments want? You can make arguments based upon all those underlying characteristics. So TLDR, big picture takeaway, step number one, whenever it comes to stakeholder analysis, is basically just a question of, give me a second, I'll plug out my earbuds. Oh, exciting, fantastic. The kind of like first step is just asking yourself that question of who's affected by a particular topic, and then subsequently figuring out how they're affected by a particular topic. But perhaps more importantly, you also want to figure out how they're going to respond to a particular topic. That's often where you're able to create kind of like offensive arguments for your side. So strategy number one, just kind of big picture, is figure out who's affected, figure out how they respond. Before I move on to talking about comparatives, any questions on that so far? If so, either put them in chat or pop them out loud, whichever you would prefer. Gorgeous. Okay, cool. Next thing, comparatives. I've spent so much time drilling this into y'all's heads that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight because I just don't think it's that significantly important. So in case you are desperately confused on this, reference the prior 2 weeks of presentations. But just because it's fun, let's do like an example. I don't know if the last slide I finished making it, but anyways, this house believes NGOs should not provide humanitarian aid in conflict areas where those areas haven't yet been stabilized. realistically, you can make really interesting comparative arguments on either side of this debate by asking yourself the question of what the alternative is. If you're a Gov team on this motion seems hard at first until you ask yourself that question, what is the comparative? And the comparative is not an NGO just ceases to exist. The comparative is that NGO provides aid somewhere else, maybe where that money can be spent more effectively, and maybe where that aid is less likely to be stolen, taken advantage of, exploited, etc. If you're op, you can also make a comparative argument. You can, for example, say, in the context of places, say Aleppo in Syria for many instances, where you don't necessarily have militaristic stability, if NGOs aren't providing aid, maybe someone else does, but maybe that someone else is a lot worse because the incentives they have are worse. So maybe, for example, if you don't have a charity providing you with food, maybe it's the local militant or terrorist group that provides you with food to curry support and favor from the local population. And the implication of that is just very simply that maybe you get increased grassroots supports for those organizations in a way that makes it harder to end conflict. So this is an example where on a certain topic, you can ask yourself that question, what is the realistic comparative / alternative, and make arguments just based upon that in a way that is often quite persuasive. Third strategy we're going to chat about. I know I'm not spending a lot of time on comparatives, but again, in case you're confused by that, feel free to seek out some of the stuff I mentioned before from week 1 and week 2. The next strategy we're going to chat a little bit about is just the idea of lateral engagement. When I say lateral engagement, this has nothing to do with pro football, although it'd be kind of funny if it did. But basically, the gist of lateral engagement is whenever you are approaching a topic, you're never approaching a topic in isolation. You're always approaching a topic in context of some opposing team. In other words, you're never just going to be standing there making arguments purely on your own. You're always going to be asking yourself the question, or you should be asking yourself the question, what is the other side realistically going to argue, and how can you deal with that? So the next strategy we're going to chat about for generating or coming up with arguments is basically, how do you A, think about what the other team is going to argue, and B, how does that affect your case construction strategy? So the main idea in terms of what I'm going to chat about here is that there's kind of 3 main steps to this idea of engaging with the other team while in prep time, even before the debate has begun. The first thing is figuring out what the other team is going to say. The second is figuring out how you construct your case around that. And the third thing is developing alternative paths to victory that are not reliant on you outright winning that clash. So what do I mean by this? First step to this idea of engaging with the other team in prep. What is the other team realistically going to say? Now, I'm going to be honest, guys, when I say in prep, you should ask yourself what the other team is going to argue. You don't need to spend 7 minutes of 15 minutes of prep asking yourself brutally difficult questions about the very best possible arguments the other team could run. If the other team has some magic bullet, fantastic argument, and you are like, oh my goodness, Crimea River, we're going to get annihilated by this incredibly sneaky argument, and maybe don't spend an enormous amount of time in prep trying to, hold in your tears over the most strategic, most impossibly convolutedly creative argument the other team could run. But what I mean is more like the minimum wage example I mentioned before. If you go into prep on this house would raise the minimum wage, at some point in time, if you pause and ask yourself, oh, what is op going to say? They're probably not going to run some wacky thing on how this causes the appreciation of the US dollar. They're probably going to be prices go up and small businesses go under. So realistically, ask yourself what the most likely or the most obviously persuasive claims from the other side are. That's step number 1. What is the other team going to say? We're going to use this example as kind of a guideline for this idea of lateral engagement. So get familiar with it. So let's say you have a motion like, we should allow cities to be held civilly responsible. In other words, you can sue cities for deaths that can be plausibly ascribed to homelessness. If you're on op on this motion, what do you think Gov is going to say? Realistically, just big picture. Yeah, Jeffrey.
It's going to lead to more action on homelessness because cities don't want to be sued.
Hang on. My computer is being bad. Apologies. 1 second. My computer is being mean to me. Say that again, Jeffrey, now that my computer has maybe changed.
It'll lead to more action on homelessness because cities don't want to be sued.
Beautiful. If you're realistically an op team on this motion, the most obvious Gov argument is going to be governments are now going to try to fix homelessness because they don't want to be sued because that's a bad look, it's expensive, yada, yada. So if you're an op team going into this motion, you should be thinking about what the Gov team is going to argue, which most likely is either a moral principle about culpability or more likely a pragmatic argument about government's incentives to not get sued. So then the question becomes, what do you do with that? And in other words, if you're an op on this motion, you know Gov is almost definitely going to run a bazillion arguments about why this is going to result in better policies aimed at limiting issues of homelessness, right? So as an op team, it would be really useful. And again, this motion is not the best example of this because it's so obvious in this motion that this is a debate about presumably on what side do we get better or worse outcomes for homeless individuals, but it's still a good guiding example. If you're op on this motion, like you want to be thinking in prep of how do we engage with this clash of helping the homeless? And that can help guide your prep. It's not going to give you arguments, but it at least guides your mindset in terms of what arguments do we want to be focusing on or thinking about. So maybe, for example, you try to develop arguments that answer that question of how do we as an opposition team win this clash? So maybe you say things like, Gov is right. Cities are going to try to limit homelessness, but they're not going to do it in good ways, like investing into shelters, like investing into educational opportunities, like providing greater drug rehabilitation support. They're probably going to respond to homelessness in really bad ways, like de facto criminalizing homelessness or locking a bunch of homeless people up, simply because that makes the problem go away. They don't get sued. They don't have to pay a bunch of money in settlements. They don't get the terrible optical damage that comes from being sued, blah, blah, blah. And that's a much easier and cheaper solution than doing the actually hard but necessary things to solve homelessness. So Gov takes a situation that's already bad and maybe makes it worse. I'm not saying that's a fantastic argument. I'm just saying that as an op team, it would be useful to ask yourself the question of how could we try to come to some argument that strives towards that impact in some capacity. Now, the final thing that you want to think about, at least in my opinion, in terms of this idea of lateral engagement with the other side, ask yourself the question of, even if we cannot win this clash, or even if the other team has some sort of argument that we can't really cleanly think of a way that we can win the debate on their impact, how can we at least make sure we don't lose to that impact? And what I mean by this is, it's not the case that you need to wait until the debate is ongoing to ask yourself the question of how are we going to respond to arguments? Because if half of debate is refuting, it makes sense that you should spend at least some time in prep thinking about refutations. So again, in this debate, maybe if you're op, you're not going to spend a ton of time in prep being able to find a way to win the clash on homelessness in terms of fixing it. But maybe you can at least ask yourself the question of how, as op, can we at least not outright lose to the Gov argument on a greater incentive to fix homelessness or any sort of moral principle? So maybe you just think about in prep ways to mitigate their impact or ways to wash out their impact, blah, 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 whatever it happens to be. And the strategic value that serves is it makes it easier as the debate goes on to come in with like pre-written responses to the kind of obvious things you expect the other team to say. And that just literally frees up more time, even just to take notes on other things, like how do we want to weigh up against their argument, or what are some other arguments I can run out of my member speech, whatever it happens to be. So TLDR, long story short, is basically just figure out what the other team is going to run, and then figure out how you want to offensively engage with that. Like, how do we want to try to tackle that clash? But also figure out, even if you can't win that impact for your side, how do we intend to defeat that argument in some way? Again, I'll use a really simple example, right? This house believes that zoos do more harm than good. We're up. Gov says zoos are bad. What do you think Gov is going to say? Oh, come on. Has no one seriously ever thought about the debate this house would ban zoos?
They would abuse animals.
Yes, obviously Gov is going to make arguments about why zoos are independently bad for animals. Again, as an op team, you want to just think about how we're going to engage with that. And that's going to help you mold your case. Now, again, the examples I've picked here are admittedly not great because the examples I've picked are instances where the other team's arguments are obviously on clash with the overall debate, but that isn't to say that's always going to happen. So even if you have a simple motion like raise the minimum wage, if you're a Gov team, you want to think a little bit about the price increase argument on op, because that might not be something that you can necessarily outright win the debate on, but you can still at least find ways to defensively engage with that argument heading into the round. Fourth strategy we're going to chat about is basically what I call the Homer Simpson approach to debating. Before that, any questions so far on any of the three strategies we've chatted about for case construction so far, either stakeholder analysis, thinking about comparatives, or engaging with the other side? Any questions so far that folks want to ask? Wow, gorgeous. No one yet. I also apologize for the comparative lack of memes in this presentation. I will try to spice them up later as we go along, but hopefully you like the images. It takes a surprising amount of time to make those things look vaguely nice. Anyways, so the TLDR of this strategy piece of advice I have is debate is filled with a bunch of incredibly smart people. So give yourselves a big round of applause. You are all very smart. Good job, everyone. You are very smart. But sometimes when you have very smart people debating about very stupid topics, and when I say stupid, I don't mean like dumb topics. I mean like sometimes you're debating about things that are not innately incredibly complicated. Sometimes the really, really intellectual world of debate overlooks some kind of obvious stuff. And that's not that this always happens. It's just to say it's something that you should be cognizant of. And if you think back on past debates you've been in, this often happens more than you'd think it would. So almost always, it can be useful to gut check motions, to ask yourself, if a random but smart person on the street saw this topic, what would they think? And also, what would a relatively new or novice debater think about this topic? So let's go through some examples of what that would look like. This house in South Africa would forcibly break up exclusive enclaves inhabited by Afrikaners, who are basically like a bunch of like fairly well-off, predominantly white settlers or descendants of settlers living in South Africa. Let's say you know nothing about this topic, nothing about South Africa, you're just reading this motion. If you're op, before you start getting into the intellectual weeds of a bunch of really crazy, esoteric, specific arguments, what is the obvious op argument that every op team should think of in this motion? Even though it sounds really trivial, even though everyone's like, I wouldn't be that like intellectually basic. What do you think is the obvious op argument or one of the obvious op arguments? Hint, it's an argument you've all run on some other motion before. The question is just if you can think about it here.
Backlash?
Yes, obviously the obvious argument here is just the average person would say backlash is going to happen to this. Like if you like break up people's enclaves and take away their land, there will be backlash. Let's say you have a motion like this house believes the media should show the full horrors of war. This is a great example. Like I've debated for a while, and somehow I think I missed what might be the most obvious op argument on this motion. If you show this motion to the average person on the street, the average watcher of a television news program, what do you think like an average person would say on this motion? Yeah, Jeffrey.
It would cause trauma.
Yes, but like even more like kind of an extension of that, like really, really basic. If you're the average person, yeah, Harshil.
Like the person of the media who's in the war, like could be harmed.
Yeah, for sure. But presumably they're going to be there anyways. So maybe they'd get harmed anyways, even though you're not showing the full horrors of war. Think of the children. Yeah, that's true. But like, I'm talking really basic, guys, like really, really basic. Like if I'm the average person, I get home from work, I could either put on the news media or I could put on a basketball game. What does that person think of this motion? Just like, I don't know. Yeah, Janet, you got it. Like the most, like I know it's easy to overlook, but the average person, if you ask them about this motion, is like, why would I want to watch bloody, gory war footage? I just won't turn on the news anymore, right? So the gist is, it's not to say that, that argument is good or it's bad or whatever. It's just to say, don't get lost in making excessively difficult arguments when there are really easy ones out there. Easy arguments are often easy because a lot of people would think of them. And judges are human beings who are also inclined to credit easy things. So don't stretch yourself too far and make sure at least some time in prep is just spent running a basic gut check of emotion. Again, you are all really smart human beings, but don't let that stop you from making sure you get the really, really obvious, really, really basic things. This also connects to what I said in week 1, which is be mindful of your own biases. So for example, maybe you are atheist and you're debating a topic about religion. Like, be willing to make pro-religion arguments and vice versa. Be cognizant of your bias and ask yourself that question of what would a non-debater or what would a new debater think of this motion, and don't get too lost in the kind of excessive weeds, etc. Fifth strategy we're going to chat about for case construction. There's about 4 more of these left, and then we'll get to refutation and then weighing at the end. But we're going to talk about the idea of journeying for impacts. This is kind of a strange way to word it, but I'll kind of explain what I mean. In my opinion, there are 2 dominant ways that people tend to prep. Some people tend to prep by focusing on warrants/mechanisms. And what I mean by that is most people will sit and prep and they'll come up with a piece of logic and then they'll be like, oh my gosh, that's a great argument, man. Let's make an argument out of it. And then they'll, illustrate it with a lot of examples, they'll impact it, blah, blah, blah. And that's totally fine. But sometimes the issue with this is like, Sometimes it's a little bit dependent on you just like randomly coming up with smart logic and kind of just like things popping into your head. And sometimes that works, but sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes it can be helpful, even though it sounds really stupid. I know it sounds stupid, and you're going to be like, Ryan, this sounds so stupid, but bear with me, bear with me. Sometimes it can help to kind of prep the opposite way. Ask yourself, what impacts are plausible on this motion? Like, what impact could we possibly see an argument linking into? And even if you have no logical clue how you get there, just ask yourself the question of like, is there a way that we can get X impact? Is there a way that we can prove this thing will happen? You might not have the answer, but putting the question in your head is a pretty good thing in terms of potentially getting there, as opposed to never thinking about that at all. So in other words, the idea here is brainstorm impacts sometimes, especially if you can't think of logic necessarily, and see if you can backfill in the logic to get to those impacts. So what does this look like, right? This house would pay gang members to not commit violent crimes. Somebody debated this at Hart House. I think it was Hart House or one of those tournaments or whatever. But what is a really obvious impact that this debate is probably going to chat about realistically? Making gangs stronger, yeah, but even more basic. Like, what is like a kind of, obvious, yeah, less crime, right? Yeah, like you guys got it. The gist is a really obvious impact in this debate that's going to be discussed is how do we increase or really decrease gang violence? Now, again, if you just ask yourself, oh, how can we prove we get less gang violence as an op team? That doesn't give you the argument, but it at least guides your prep. And in case you haven't noticed this, I'm really, really personally big on asking questions in prep. I think that it's often one of the best ways that you can prepare, because if you can try to figure out what you don't know, that'll help you try to know things by the end of prep, as opposed to never asking those questions and forgetting about important stuff. This house regrets the decline of the humanities and universities. This is kind of a weird, kind of odd, funky type motion. And a lot of teams struggle with this motion because it's not obviously clear, like, what is this debate even about? Like, what are we even impacting to? So it might be helpful to actually ask yourself that question of what impacts could we plausibly look for in this debate, right? And you might come up with certain sets of impacts and then try to backfill in analysis that gets you there. How do we get good outcomes for students? How do we improve research opportunities that look into pressing societal issues? Now, again, does this give you arguments? No. Does it help guide your prep? Yeah, probably. This house regrets the decline of Pan-Africanism, which is a sort of political and cultural artistic ideology that says that the African people and their diaspora are kind of connected in a kind of common shared fate and sort of common shared background and history. Again, kind of funky motion, like what impacts are plausible here? I don't know, but maybe just ask yourself that question. What impacts could you plausibly search for here? And maybe you're gonna come up with impacts that you don't really know how they factor into the debate. Like, I don't know, I'm not sure how conflict is gonna factor into this debate, but it seems plausible that somehow conflict resolution could come up. It seems possible that foreign aid could somehow come up, political, economic integration or development. Again, this doesn't give us arguments, but it can guide your focus. Final example I'll kind of do that can be kind of weird, right? Say you have this house regrets the cultural, sort of the culture of fearing death, right? Like, again, really, really weird motion, because it's not exactly clear like what this debate is about, what the clash is going to be, what the focus is going to be. But if you try to first brainstorm what types of general arguments are there, or sorry, impacts are there, that might help guide your thought process for like, well, what mechanisms, what pieces of logic, what warrants can we end up running? And maybe you can then create arguments by first thinking about broad types of impacts: fulfillment, planning, like planning for the future, paranoia, agency, choice, all those types of things can kind of help you. So big picture takeaway here is just whenever you're brainstorming and prep, it can be helpful sometimes, even though it's not going to give you arguments, to try to like think of possible impacts and then figure out if you can get there. Sometimes you can't, and don't press yourself too far. Like if you're going to be one of those people that's like, oh, but how do we impact to nuclear war? That's not a great strategy because it's probably going to be hard to do that. But if you can impact to increased economic development, if you can impact out to stronger political connections between different countries, those things can often be helpful in guiding where you prioritize time during prep. That's kind of weird, but general piece of advice. Okay, sixth kind of general piece of advice for approaching prep, and this is not admittedly very helpful, but like illustrations help. So some motions are kind of wonky because it's not really super duper looper clear like what this looks like in the real world. So like ask yourself that, what does this actually look like? So if you have this motion, deplatforming movements on university campuses are net bad, like this is kind of abstract and kind of weird, but if you can give like a tangible example of it, of like what this looks like, of a very racist speaker coming to Middlebury's campus several years ago, that might help dictate your prep a little bit more and be like, oh, so that's what this debate is about. Really weird example I debated not too long ago. This house believes the use of erotic capital by women does more harm than good. Very weird debate. Not really clear exactly what it's hinting at. Maybe you can like try to come up with examples of this. The info slide that we debated mentioned sugar baby. Get it? Sugar. Anyways, but the point is like trying to think of what this motion looks like what does this look like, and trying to visualize it can often be a pretty helpful strategy just for at least kind of starting your thought process and stuff like that. So TLDR, think about what types of examples might be relevant in this debate, or what does this actually look like in the real world and stuff like that. So for example, a few months ago, there was a university British Parley tournament that set the motion, this house prefers a world in which the majority of students attended boarding schools or something like that. If you like think about this motion for a quick second, it sounds really interesting in the abstract, like, ooh, most students going to boarding schools. But if you actually like picture, like illustrate this, like tell me what this looks like, you're going to get like a kind of horrifying reality, very possibly, or maybe good reality if you're Dove, of like what this is realistically going to look like. If you just visualize like almost every student in the United States leaving their household every August to go off to, even at the age of, elementary school or whatever, to go off to some private boarding school or whatever, like just illustrating what that looks like can often help you generate arguments by grounding your analysis in the real world. Seventh thing we're going to chat about is arguing based on perception. This is where we're going to use some audience participation. So ready your buzzers because I'm going to turn to you guys. Perceptual impacting, in my opinion, is a really fun way of making hard to prove arguments easier to prove. And what I mean when I say that is it's often hard to prove that impacts will definitely happen, but it's a lot easier to prove that people believe they'll happen. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is maybe a policy, for example, increases the risk of war. Well, maybe we don't know if it's going to cause war, but it definitely can make people scared of war. Like people's perception that war is more likely is very, very real and very, very certain, even if actual war isn't. If a policy creates fears of recession, like what the Fed is doing right now, maybe we don't actually know whether or not hiking interest rates is going to cause inflation, but we kind of do know that it's going to cause the perception that a recession might be imminent. So we'll take some examples of this. This house believes the Mexican government should adopt measures that enable one cartel to monopolize the drug market. And just illustrate this for a second, these are some examples. Maybe the Mexican government only, for example, targets certain cartels, but doesn't target one cartel. Maybe it stops arresting leaders from one particular cartel, etc. Guys, what do you think this policy will be perceived as? Will people like this policy or dislike this policy, perceptually?
Dislike.
Yeah, why?
Because the government should be condemning all cartels.
So yeah, presumably what you might say is, take a step out of debate land for a second. A lot of people on the ground would not like the optics of this motion. And the media is not going to be generous in portraying this. Because even if in debate land, Gov can be like, this is going to be great. The Mexican government's going to limit cartel violence. That's probably true. But the perception of this policy might not be as rosy. Because even if in debate land, we can be like, this is the strategically best strategy, this is the best thing to do. If you're a tough on crime voter and you're really scared of crime, when the government's like, we are going to stop arresting leaders from this particular cartel, you're not going to react by cheering, you're going to react with some degree of terror. This house opposes the derogatory usage of inherent identity characteristics of dominant groups, i.e. calling people a Karen. What is the perception of these phrases? Like, how are they perceived in society generally?
Mocking groups of privilege.
Yeah, and the word you use there is important, mocking, right? Like in many instances, you might say like, perhaps part of the like perception of these terms is they're kind of like clouded in meme speak, right? And like kind of like meme talk. And maybe that affects how they're perceived. So maybe when you call someone a Karen, for instance, maybe it trivializes what you're calling them. or maybe there are certain implications of how these phrases are perceived. This house believes South Korea should abolish military conscription. All right. A motion set at this for American high schoolers. TOC set this motion like last April or whatever, right? If you're op on this motion, counterintuitively, what might you say is like, how might this policy potentially be perceived, especially within maybe more nationalistic or kind of war-wary electoral constituencies within South Korea? Like, what might be the perception of this? Not just positive or negative, but how will this policy be perceived in general? Just like generally, anyone can shout out an idea if they have one, or raise your hand on Zoom, or send me a handwritten letter, or none, but that would be sad. Well, as an idea, if you're in South Korea and you live in fairly strong fear, for example, of maybe the potentiality of, Julian, you have a great example here. Like a lot of people are going to perceive this policy as an action that makes South Korea less militarily ready. Maybe it's not true. Maybe objectively, South Korea is totally fine relying on volunteers, but maybe the perception of this policy is that South Korea is not going to be as prepared to fend off, say, for example, a military incursion waged by Kim Jong-un. And that has political impacts, which exist regardless of whether or not that perception is true. One last example that I think is a nice illustration of this. This house believes war memorials should honor lives lost on all sides of conflict. What is the general perception of this? Like, especially if you're an op team, is this going to be perceived well or not well?
It would be perceived as disrespectful towards those from your country or your side.
Yeah. Like again, this is not to generalize, but like genuinely think about what would happen if the United States was like, we will establish a memorial for the soldiers who died in World War II, but we'll also make sure to memorialize, for instance, like German soldiers. Imagine what happens and how controversial that is. And then you can, of course, make arguments based upon, well, if Gov wants to talk about why memorialization is good, maybe the outcome of this motion is just that no one comes to these memorials, no one funds these memorials, because bluntly, they're just not going to be perceived in a good way, even if objectively Gov is right, and this is a great thing. The other thing I'll quickly flag, and then we do have to move on because we're running a little bit behind vis-a-vis the slides, but it's also helpful to ask yourself, like, how is something perceived, not just in terms of making arguments, but also making and warranting individual arguments. This house would auction off the long-term right to govern bankrupt cities for profit. What do you think most op teams will say on this motion? Big picture, like one-liner. It's probably the first thought that popped into your head. I promise you everyone else is thinking it. Anyone want to take a stab?
Big companies get to buy cities.
Well, yeah, that's the motion, but what do you think most op teams are going to say for that?
This control can be bad.
Yeah, everyone's going to be like, this is really freaking horrible, right? Like companies are going to be terrible. They're going to run these cities in really awful, atrocious, terrible, mean, demonic, terrible ways, right? Well, that's what every op team ever is going to say, right? You're selling off cities to be run by companies. Like obviously, this is going to be bad. And so what you might say as a gov team counterintuitively is, yeah, op is right. This is going to be perceived terribly. It's going to actually be perceived really terribly. And that's for op's own argument. If companies are believed to be running these cities horribly, there's going to be the perception of that. Now, why is that good? Well, maybe what you'd say is people are going to perceive these companies as being neo-colonial, as being profit maximizing. And that means there's going to be a huge amount of media scrutiny on these companies, a huge amount of government regulation on these companies, because everyone's going to be horrified of the idea of companies running these cities in really terrible ways. Just look at the legacy of company towns in the United States. And maybe as Gov, you actually use that argument on perception to mechanize an argument about why actually these companies will face a huge amount of pressure to overcome that perception and prove that they're not running these cities terribly. They're actually doing things to improve the long-term economic viability of the city. So the idea is you can often use perception and how something might be perceived as a way to warrant out why something will happen as a consequence. Really weird example of this, if you're ever on a gov side of a motion, that's hard because you're defending a policy that seems very controversial. There's a very weird gov argument that you can make, which is maybe this policy in and of itself is very controversial, But maybe that's actually good because it means that governments will then face political pressure to pass other policies that will in some way rectify other related issues in the status quo. So maybe, for example, you have a motion that seemingly has a chance of increasing gun violence. Maybe, for example, this now puts additional pressure on governments to do other things like invest, say, into mental health facilities, because there is the public perception that this policy and its negative effects needs to be counteracted in some other way. So the takeaway is you don't just need to think about what actually will happen because of emotion. You can also think about how people will perceive of things happening and how that might have potential impacts. Eighth piece of advice, this is the weirdest, I'll warn you right now. Analyzing backwards. Most, especially policy debates, go like this. This house believes that X government should do Y thing. This is how, especially if you're Californian, this is how almost all motions tend to be written, especially like in American parley, especially on the West Coast, at least in my experience, at the risk of generalizing. Most debates are like, this person should do this thing. And most debaters approach these motions by being like, is this idea / policy a good or bad thing? But there's another layer to this debate, which is not just how does an actor doing this thing result in some societal change, whether that's good or bad, but in many instances, when someone does something, it changes them as well. And I know that sounds like very philosophical, like relationship advice, like everything you do changes who you are as a person. But I mean it very pragmatically, and we're going to do some examples of this. So one really common example is social justice debates. One of the most chronically underanalyzed arguments, in my personal opinion, is in lots of social movement motions that are like, this house believes that X movement should embrace this advocacy. You can make arguments about how this will affect activists themselves, why something might be cathartic, why something might be empowering, why something might be individually good for those activists alone. But you can also make this argument more powerful by talking not just about, well, why might this be good for the actor implementing this or bad for the actor implementing this, but why can this also change the actor themselves? So let's give some examples. This house would ban media companies from publishing very graphic depictions of terrorist attacks, all right? So let's say that you are gov on this motion, right? What you might want to think about is not just is it good or bad to have graphic depictions of terrorist attacks in the media, but you might also want to think about how would this policy change the media internally? So, for example, if there's news of a terrorist attack, media companies are probably going to change who they send to cover that attack. You're no longer sending in your big fancy camera crews and your dramatic reporters who are going to run breaking news headlines. You're probably going to send in your investigative reporters, the people who are going to be writing long form articles on what happened or explaining in more sort of descriptive detail, but perhaps not visual detail what happened. Or maybe, for example, you can think about how does this change the type of person who wants to be the guy who is the journalist responding to these sorts of terrorist attacks? Or maybe you want to talk about things like, what else happens in terms of how journalists get trained. So you can often make arguments not just about media banning this is good, but also how does this ban change the media internally? And why, for example, might you get better reporting on these terrorist attacks in general? Because the way the media responds to this internally is good. So maybe, for example, to make this a little bit clearer, maybe on Gov you make an argument that says, not only is it good to not have these graphic depictions being published, because they foster a bad response, yada, yada. But there's also another benefit, which is that it changes the type of reporter who gets sent into these scenarios. So you get less sensationalized reporting. It means you get more accurate reporting, yada, yada. Different example, a little bit clearer maybe. This house would introduce racial quotas for healthcare professionals like doctors, nurses, et cetera. What you might talk about on this motion is not just why having these quotas in place is good, but also how having these quotas internally changes the structure of healthcare institutions. How do you as a hospital get enough minorities, for example, into medical school to satisfy and fulfill this quota? How do you as a corporate board, for example, message this policy to members of marginalized backgrounds to attract them into this career trajectory? So the kind of point is, on this motion, you don't just need to be talking about the impact of more racially diverse healthcare staffs. You can also make arguments about how, for example, this will create pathways and why this will, for example, change the structure of healthcare institutions like medical schools to provide things like better financial aid to minority students, why this changes the way that you compose your corporate boards, because now you need to be more diverse because you need to attract individuals who come from marginalized and minority backgrounds, et cetera, right? So the kind of main takeaway I want to flag here is whenever you debate, especially policy motions, don't ignore the effect that the implementation has on whoever's doing the implementation, and kind of be cognizant of like, how does this change the internal structure of institutions when those institutions, per emotion and Gov fiat power, now get to do something. That was very weird, confusing, strange, bizarre, and ugly. So questions on that, since I'm sure like at least some of you might be like not 100% down with like what I just described, or general comments that folks want to add in of things that are like not fully clicking. Are we all like totally rock solid on that? Wow. Very impressive. Very impressive. Era, are you rock solid on that?
I am very much rock solid on that.
Wow, very impressive. Jacqueline, do you have a question? If you want, you can either send it in chat or you can unmute, whichever you would like.
Oh, okay, cool. I don't know how to word this, but like there's a motion that you just like have absolutely no idea, or like the other team provides like a super good case. Like, what do you do?
Yeah, so when you say like super, like you have no idea, like if the reason you have no idea is because you don't know what the motion, like if you lack spec knowledge, I'll talk about that in a little bit. And I published some documents last week on advice for that. If the other team's case is really good, it's often an opportunity for you. It's often the case that when other teams' arguments are very good, you can try to engage with higher level analysis by giving relatively good responses and beefing those responses up to the point that they almost function as independent arguments. And so you can often like respond to good teams' cases by thinking really intensely about how to rebut those arguments really well and really thoroughly. And so even if that means that you spend less time making your own arguments, more time beefing up responses, you can often turn those responses into independent paths to victory for your side. The other thing I'd say in terms of like what happens when you're just like genuinely lost on emotion, I think the best thing to do, pick one argument or even just literally one impact and blow the hell out of it and be like, this is the biggest thing in this debate. So for example, the motion type that I by far, outside of popular culture motions, but I know nothing about, the motion type that I feel the least comfortable with in general, personally, is any motion about how we should restructure the like constituencies that we use to determine like electoral outcomes. So for example, like this house believes that we should delegate positions in legislatures by age rather than geography, or this house would apportion legislative seats based on socioeconomic status as opposed to where you live. Like those motions to me are like very weird and strange, and like I'm not a fan of them. So whenever I debate those, my strategy is almost always just to like find one argument that I vibe with, run it really thoroughly, and just try to blow the hell out of that argument and say this is the most important thing, rather than try to spread like my base too thin and try to run a bunch of things I just don't vibe with, basically is what I'd say. Okay, last thing really quickly, and then we're going to move on. Off-clash arguments. The TLDR of off-clash argumentation is just not all arguments will fit really cleanly into one big area of clash. And oftentimes it can be helpful to run something that fits into a different area of clash that you can then weigh heavily on later on in the debate if that's useful. So for example, maybe you have a debate about whether the decline of the US as a global power is good. There's a bunch of different major clashes in this debate: conflict, economic development, environment. But maybe you, for example, can like run some off-clash argument on like dollarization and why the fading of US dollar hegemony is bad. Is that going to win you the debate on its own? 100% no. I mean, I love econ, but like even like, nah, bro, no. But maybe, just maybe, if everything else in the debate is kind of like shaping up to like low-key just be a wash, maybe that argument can be really significant or really important. So the idea is be analytically creative and weigh smartly in a way that you can run arguments that kind of break other deadlocks in the debate that otherwise are kind of hard to figure out and hard to win on, etc. So before we chat about argument structure, any questions on any of that, folks, or things that are like generally confusing or kind of like not clicking for folks? Are y'all goods? Impressive. Wonderful. You can also interrupt me with jokes in case you have funny jokes you want to say, because funny jokes are funny. Okay, second thing, this is a lot quicker: argument structure. In general, the quality of analysis matters way more than anything else. And there's a bunch of different ways that people will tell you to format arguments. claim or an impact, thesis, mechanism, link, impact, uniqueness, link, impact, whatever you want to call these things. The main gist is, oh, and just a quick side note, alphabet soup, fantastic, delicious, but not when it comes to acronyms and debate. Well, it is. I mean, like having alphabet soup while you debate is delicious. I've never done that, but I should. It'd be really tasty. But anyways, no matter what structure or format of argument you've been told to use, there's a few things that arguments should generally have. First, they should have some sort of thesis, some sort of like big picture narrative. This is what we're going to try to prove. And I think that as a general piece of advice, you want to tagline arguments in a way that makes them sound not stupid. Like, don't be like, our first argument is the economy. Like, that's so stupid, bro. Like, you think a judge is going to vote for you because you were like, first argument, the econ. No, like that doesn't work. No. Run something more exciting. Like, get me out of my seat with excitement. Make argument taglines sound cool. So for example, if you have a motion about land redistribution, don't be like, this will be done poorly. Be like, this will be done really fucking corruptly and in cronyistic ways, and that's going to exacerbate inequality and inflame ethnic tensions. Don't be like, oh, agricultural output. No, be like, this will like massively bring down agricultural inefficiency. Quick note, the way I worded this made it sound like I'm saying you should use bigger words. That's not what I mean. What I just mean is that you want to use like more powerful or more like meaningful taglines, since that's what's ultimately going to end up kind of like being like, you know, kind of resonant with a judge. Second part of every argument, or every argument should have some sort of logic, some sort of warrant, some sort of mechanism. In general, if you can have multiple, this is good. But obviously, there's a diminishing marginal return of having additional mechanisms. That was very hypocritical of me to say. But if you're like debating about invading North Korea, right? If you are on op and you're going to say this invasion will fail, you can come up with like a bunch of arguments and a bunch of warrants for why. But like at the end of the day, like only some of them are really going to matter. So you want to prioritize mechanisms and prioritize arguments based on what your burden in the debate is, but also based on what is most likely to be disputed and what arguments are most likely to be impactful by the end of a debate. I also think arguments should generally include illustrations. And what I mean by that is actually grounding arguments in the real world and being like, this is a real thing that has real, clear, tangible, meaningful, actual impacts. The more proper nouns you can use, the better. Proper nouns are when you're like saying things that have like capital letters as their first letter or whatever, because they like are like actually like real things. So the more times that you can be like, here is a country, person, company, whatever, that like has like a real name, and grounding your arguments in that, ooh, as a spicy meatball, it's a good thing. So for example, if you are debating on a motion like whether or not the glorification of hard work is good or bad, like if you can like, you know, illustrate what this looks like, that's fantastic. So if you're going to make an argument on Gov, for instance, about how the glorification of success often means that society begins to correlate success with hard work, and you want to illustrate why this is bad for minority groups, maybe you talk about how the glorification of hard work manifests in narratives like pull yourself up by the bootstraps and stuff like that, yada, yada, yada. I also think, and I talked about this 2 weeks ago, but also last week, low-key, I'm in like, clearly like I have like something going on with comparatives, but basically the idea is like being really, really comparative is fantastic. And asking yourself in every single argument, what is bad about their side that is not true in our side, or what is bad about their side that is better in our side? That's a really good question to ask yourself because it forces you to remain comparative. And I think every good argument should have a link into the motion that clearly explains why something is better on your side compared to the other. Every argument should also have an impact. Why do we care about your argument? Why does it matter? And it's often the case that impacts are the place that you can afford to be emotional and afford to be like, this is, you know, going to like feed families. Like this is going to like, I don't know, insert emotion here, emotion. Another quick little tip, it can often be a fun little drill to force yourself to link impacts to the level of an individual person. Like, how does an individual person benefit from your argument? Sometimes you can't do that, but sometimes you can. And if you can't, it's a fun like little tip. So try it. So for example, these are some examples. They're so beautifully worded. Fun fact about how I create these presentations, I import these like really massive Google Slides templates. And then I like look through all the like pre-written slides, like the template slides. And I'm like, what do I like about this template? And every so often, like I delete like 90% of them. And sometimes I have like ones I'm like, oh, that's so pretty. This is one of those, oh, that's so pretty slides. But I awkwardly
Do you
have to,
use
like,
Carnival slides?
I use Slides Go, I think.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. Oh, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. But like this was one of the keeper slides because it was so pretty. So it used to have like little extra boxes here, but I got rid of them. So everyone say rip extra boxes. Can we get an F in chat for the extra boxes? It was a very sad day for the
Rip extra boxes.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, F.
Yes. Also F. Yes, precisely. Thank you, everyone. Last thing, I think argument should have some like little framing. Every argument should be framed as well as if you were accused of committing a heinous crime that would land, or like you were accused of committing a really bad crime, you can frame someone else for it. Frame, it's fantastic. So what do I mean when I say framing? I'm gonna be honest with y'all. Hang on, I will even come off screen share for a second to say this. I have no clue what the actual hell framing is. Everyone uses a different word for it. Like I've heard 17 different interpretations of the word framing, but what I mean when I say framing in this context is just like, why should an argument be weighed heavily? And why does the argument matter in the grand scope of a debate? This is really wonderful if you are a later speaker, because you could just be like, pluck this Wayne and drop it into my speech. And now I got a nice Wayne stew. Stew like the food stew, not a name stew. You know? Just want to be clear about that. I don't know how to make stew. Beef stew is delicious. But anyways, so basically, like, for example, if you have a motion like this house, this is a really weird motion, but it was said at Austral. So like, I don't know, hashtag low-key, maybe slay queen, it's a good motion. I don't know. But anyways, oh, by the way, guys, just so you know, when I ever say things like that, I don't know slang terms. So I say random slang terms at random times because I think it makes me sound cool. Hashtag dope. Anyways.
And we can teach you more later.
Yeah, I learned something today. What did I learn? I learned, wait, I forget what it was. I learned a word today. I learned a cool slang word today that someone told me about. I forget what, I'll remember. Anyways, so let's think of a motion like this house opposed to self-help narratives that instruct people to reduce reliance on external validation. As an op team, maybe you run, or sorry, a gov team, maybe you run some sort of argument about why this is a really alienating thing for self-help books, podcasts, whatever, say, and it means people check out of them. Like if you like pick up a book and they're like, just stop caring about how many Instagram likes you get, people put the book away, they stop listening to the podcast. The way you could frame that argument is by saying this should be weighed heavily because every other impact in the debate is logically contingent on people actually engaging with self-help systems. If they never use the book, if they never listen to the podcast, yada, 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 then like nothing ever is going to end up changing. And therefore, this is the highest magnitude impact in the debate. Okay, quick other random argument structuring medieval advice. The biggest thing, and I mentioned this earlier, speed the debate up. What I mean, that was really loud. I hope I didn't destroy your eardrums because I just destroyed mine. When I say speed the debate up, what I basically mean is like get the debate like rolling, like get it going. Like you guys know how like there's like those school assemblies that are like supposed to start at like 11:10 a.m. or whatever, and then they don't start until like 11:22, and everyone's sitting there awkwardly in the assembly, and they're like, don't do that. It's really annoying. So 3 specific implications I want to flag. First thing is it can be helpful to integrate some response. If you're like gov, integrate some responses to what you think op is maybe low-key hashtag going to say before they say it. Only do this for the really important stuff though, because you do have a partner and your partner is really cool. So yay, partner. Second thing is anticipate the most obvious way another team could respond to your argument and try to make your argument smartly built around that so you're not susceptible to that. And lastly, I think it can be helpful to do some intervention proofing. So like we've all been there where like the judge is like, you know, I just didn't buy Gov's second argument because insert reason here. And we're all like, that was not what our argument was. Intervention proof. If there's an obvious way your argument could get misinterpreted, like flag that and be like, we're not saying X, we're saying Y. And then clarify what your argument is talking about and sort of proof against intervention. Okay. That was like 200 slides just on argument construction and generation. So any questions on any of that so far, folks, on this argument stuffs?
I was wondering about the slide where you were talking about you have to choose arguments that like address the burden or something like that. So I was wondering like how to identify the burden when you look at a motion, especially like I think in the motion that you gave where it was like opposing invading North Korea. So like what would be the burdens? Because aren't you just trying to like, isn't the burden just to say, oh, like invading North Korea is bad? So like
Yeah.
that's a pretty like vague thing
Yeah,
to,
for
like,
sure. That's a fantastic question. So the TLDR is that when I say, oh wait, I think I'm, okay, here we go. So when we talk about priority in terms of burdens, the idea is like, what do you have to prove in order to win the debate? So take this motion, for example. This motion is really, really nice as an op team, because as an op team, you just have to defeat one of Gov's many burdens. So for example, let's think about what Gov has to prove on this motion, right? If you're a goving this house would invade North Korea, it seems like you're going to have to prove this invasion will work if you want to win the debate. Like, it's going to be really hard to win the debate as a gov team defending a failed invasion of the world's fourth largest military. So if you're gov, you probably have to prove this invasion is going to succeed, because if you lose that argument, it doesn't matter what other arguments you win. You've already lost the debate. But even if Gov proves this invasion is successful, is that enough for them to win the debate? Not really, because they still have to show that the post-conflict outcomes for a post-invasion North Korea would be better than the status quo, which sounds easier to prove, admittedly, but like, I mean, like hashtag Iraq didn't go so well. So what makes us think North Korea is going to go so well? So the idea is on this motion, Gov has kind of a dual burden. And you're right, like all that Gov has to prove is invading North Korea is a good idea. But when I say burden, what I basically mean is, what do you actually absolutely have to prove, or what arguments are vitally important for you to prove to win the debate? And in this debate, Gov has two burdens. A, the invasion succeeds. B, the invasion is desirable. If op defeats either of those burdens, op wins. If you can prove that the invasion fails, op wins, because it doesn't matter if the invasion is desirable in theory, because it hashtag fails. If you can prove that the invasion succeeds as Gov, fantastic, you're halfway home, but you still need to prove that the invasion is actually desirable. If you only prove one half of those things, or zero out of those two things, you are hashtag not slaying. So what you need to do is prove both of those burdens. Otherwise, you're kind of, in a pretty rough place and unlikely to do particularly well, et cetera. So the main gist of when I say burdens is like, ask yourself the question, if you're a gov team, or this can happen to op teams, what arguments are vital for you to win? Like, what arguments do you have to win in order to win the debate? Sometimes burdens are not difficult. This house would raise the minimum wage. Gov's burden is like a higher minimum wage good. Op's burden is like higher minimum wage bad. But when it comes to like motions, especially where multiple things have to be true for the motion to succeed, like this motion works, this motion is desirable, blah, 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 that's where there's multiple burdens oftentimes. So for example, just to take a different motion, this house believes that South Korean feminists should advocate for the conscription of women. On that motion, if you're a gov team, if you want to make arguments about why this is a good thing to do, you kind of have two burdens. A, advocating for conscription will work, or even if it doesn't, there are still positive benefits of the act of advocating for the conscription of women. And B, the conscription of women is actually in line with feminist ideals. If you don't prove those things, or don't prove the offshoot of burden number one, you're probably most likely going to end up losing the debate, and you kind of need to prove both to win. Does that kind of make sense? Like the idea of like burden work, kind of?
yeah, that does. Thank you.
Okay, coolio. Where was I? Okay, refutations. I have planned time a little poorly, but you know what? That's okay, because as long as everyone makes friends, then we're happy. Refutations. What is refutation? I don't think refutation is actually like outright disproving arguments. It's like doing enough work to arguments to show that arguments from the other side are not winning. And that basically means that in a lot of instances, argumentation and refutation are low-key almost the same thing. In other words, refuting an argument is kind of just like making arguments about the inverse. So if their argument is like, this is bad for the economy, refuting is kind of like saying it's good for the economy. So all of those strategies we talked about earlier, stakeholders, comparative analysis, lateral engagement, dumbing it down, impacting, perception, working backwards, off-clash argumentation, illustrations, all of those things work for refutations as well. Like all those same strategies apply for when you're refuting arguments, same thing as when you're making arguments. But you can also think of some additional strategies for generating refutations. I'm going to flag 6 of them. The first is flipping an argument. And the main kind of like idea, oh, by the way, everyone put an F in chat for Zach. Zach is this kid here. He's a very good debater, but he is currently in London, where it is. What time is it in London? Let's take a look. I think they're some number of hours ahead. World clock. Where is it? 1:51 a.m. Zach, you better not be on here. Zach, you better be sleeping. Sorry, Zach. Anyways, basically flipping is kind of the fine art of taking arguments the other side has made and attempting to turn them to your side, taking their impact and showing it actually works for your side. So let's say that you're opping the motion. This house would make voting compulsory in the US, required voting, in other words. Gov says this is great because more minorities vote, they tend to vote liberal, therefore more liberal policy. Opp maybe flips that argument by saying, actually, no. Maybe it's true that liberal parties get elected more into office on your side, but we actually flip this argument because liberal parties are way more complacent on your side and way less incentivized to care about minorities, because now there's no real threat of marginalized groups voting for conservatives. So if you're the Democrats, you no longer have to really do good things, for example, for Black voters, because right now you need to at least do enough good things to make them turn out to vote and get excited about you. Now it's not even really clear if you actually have to do that. If you're goving the motion, nationalize pharmaceutical companies, right? If Opp says, well, this is bad because governments aren't ever going to give medication to poor countries because it's going to be a politically bad look, maybe Gov turns that and says, actually, no, we get more pharmaceutical products going to poor countries on our side because companies will literally never sell there. It's not profitable, but governments are fine incurring a loss in giving pharmaceutical products overseas to poor countries because there's geopolitical reasons like soft power, et cetera, that make that a good thing to do. And this is honestly the best thing that you can do when you're refuting arguments. It's one thing to say, oh, well, their argument is not that important. It's a fantastic thing to say their argument literally flips against them and actively works for our side. So how do you do that, right? The kind of best thing to do is imagine you're trying to prove an argument in the opposite direction. They say this is good for economy. Boo, this is bad for economy. They say this is good for political capital. Boo, this is bad for political capital. Try to take the argument they made and literally just run through all 9 strategies I talked about earlier for trying to make the inverse flip side of that same exact argument. And here's the other thing I want to flag. You won't always be able to do this successfully, but if you can try to do it successfully, it's harder for teams to win debates on those arguments because there's now some uncertainty. Are you really the only team that's going to benefit the economy? Are you really the only team that's going to decrease terrorism? It's not so much of a slam dunk anymore for the other side, as much as it is kind of like a battle for, well, maybe the other side does win the economic clash, but it's much closer than it originally would have been. The second strategy that you can use for engaging with arguments, maybe you can't outright beat an argument, but you can at least still try in some capacity to mitigate its importance. And the idea of mitigation is to basically take an argument and make its impact seem smaller. So the impact from the other argument still stands, but the goal is to take an argument and say, you have this argument, let me shrink it so I can shrink your impact enough so that I can outweigh it. I've listed some questions that you can ask yourself. If you ask yourself all 5 of these questions before, like every time you hear an argument, you'll generally be able to come up with at least 3 responses to that argument. They won't flip the argument, but they'll mitigate it. And if you can take their impact down enough, you can then add some weighing on top of that wins you the round. So for example, in areas where crime is high, this house would allow judges to basically punish people really, really harshly. Gov says, yay, deterrence. Opp runs a bunch of mitigatory reasons why deterrence is not going to be that much higher in the Gov world. Now, none of these responses flip the Gov argument on crime. They mitigate it. But what you might then say is, here's a bunch of mitigation to their argument on deterrence. Therefore, implication, weighing, our argument outweighs theirs because their impact is so marginal that it can't possibly outweigh all of our non-marginal argumentation. This house believes that patents do more harm than good. Opp says, nah. Oh yeah, Jeffrey, go ahead.
How do you differentiate between mitigating and direct refutation? Because on the previous slide, like one of the mitigation arguments was that like crime isn't rational. I mean, yeah, it isn't always rational or happens in the heat of the moment. Like, couldn't that be considered direct refutation too, rather than mitigation? Like, how do you distinguish the two?
They mean the same thing. Mitigation is a type of rebuttal, a type of refutation, whatever you want to call it. It's just one way of doing it. So basically, TLDR, they kind of function very similarly. So if you had a motion like patents do more harm than good, op runs an argument, patents are necessary to create innovation. Gov might run mitigation to this. Here's a bunch of other reasons why actually patents are not the only thing that drives innovation. There's other exogenous reasons to believe that companies will continue innovating. Therefore, the benefit you get is marginal. Therefore, you can weigh very heavily on some other argument, like, for example, corporate consolidation. I've just put pragmatics in brackets as kind of an indication of who knows what the argument is. But you would couple mitigation with weighing to beat their argument. Third thing, gut check arguments. It'll help you a lot. When I say gut check, I basically mean ask yourself, is this argument actually hashtag slang with the queens? Because some arguments might be really cool. And in the era of online debating, teams have gotten really good at this thing called lying, not outright lying, but lying like making totally nonsense things sound like not entirely totally nonsense things. And like sometimes like arguments are like, bro, what are you even saying? So I'll give an example. I literally debated this like recently-ish, right? This house opposes religious charity. Gov is like, well, actually, if we didn't have religious charity, like NGOs would totally fill the void. Like, yeah, it's a fine debate argument, but like this is crazy. Like if you think about this for like real world, yo, you think that Oxfam's gonna do it like has the money the Catholic Church has? Like hell no. Pope Francis is like so rich, he could like shit money out of his butt and he'd probably still be like hella rich or whatever, right? Like the point is like just gut check some arguments, because like oftentimes it's just the case that like you're gonna like you can just beat arguments by being like, bro, like this just doesn't make sense. Fourth thing, this is the best piece of advice I have in this entire presentation. So if you're still with me, which like A, kudos to you, and also B, like you know, hooray for you, I guess. But this is probably the best thing I'm gonna say. So your time is well worth it. Rebutting through characterization. What do I mean? Every argument presupposes a certain worldview. If you can disprove that worldview, you disprove the argument by extension. In other words, every argument is premised on some characterization. Remember characterization from before? It's basically, why are people the way they are, right? If you can disprove the characterization that an argument is based on, you can defeat the argument without ever having to directly refute it. I'm going to give two examples of this that I think illustrate this pretty nicely, and then I'm happy to take questions on it. The academization of social justice movements is basically the kind of general trend of social justice movements increasingly becoming reliant upon or involving academics like professors. This house opposes that process, is the motion we're going to chat about. Gov says the rise of academics within social movements has been bad because when you have a bunch of professors in your movement, those professors crowd out with their research the voices of real people on the ground. And that's bad. What does this argument implicitly presume in terms of what this process of academization looks like? What does this presume in terms of characterization? Well, it presumes two things. One, it presumes that academics are actually able to crowd out other people's voices. And implicit in that, this argument is reliant on a characterization that says that academics are speaking in the same places that traditional activists are speaking. So either the professor from Yale speaks or the poor, marginalized, systemically oppressed kid from a city speaks. The second thing this argument is premised upon vis-a-vis characterization is that the type of research these people are doing is not really good for the social justice movement or is not sufficiently sort of exploring the lived experiences of people. If you're Gov, or I guess Op in this case, you might want to respond to this argument, not just by responding to the actual analysis, but by responding to that characterization and trying to disprove that characterization. Maybe you say, look, academics are not publishing in the same spaces as traditional activists. They have time constraints, they have professional obligations, they're probably publishing in places like research journals, and they're often basing their academic research on lived experiences, things like victim statements, like things like interviews with people who survived certain historical events. Now, this year, we have not responded to a single argument Gov has made, but we've responded to the characterization that our argument was based on, and in doing so, we took out their argument. Here's a different example. This house would allow ex-felons to become cops. Gov says, this is great, because when ex-felons become police officers, they're going to be better cops, they're going to act less violently, they're going to have empathy for people in the community. what does this argument presume in terms of characterization? Well, it presumes that the type of person who leaves the prison system and then becomes a police officer is doing so because they want in some way to reform that system. But if you're op, you might contest that characterization. Maybe you'd say, look, there's other ways that this set of people who leave prison and become cops could presumably be characterized. For example, maybe you might say on op, look, the characterization of this argument, the type of ex-felon who becomes a cop, is not what Gov is saying it is. Gov's argument would be true if their premise, their characterization was correct, but it's not. Maybe on op you say something like, look, the sort of person who goes through a brutally traumatizing and incredibly racist prison and criminal justice system, and then leaves that system and decides that of all the opportunities they had or could potentially have, they want to become the enforcer of that system. That's not your average ex-felon. That's not your average cop. It's probably a person who has some other reason for wanting to join the police force. Maybe it's the fact that they feel very resentful for what violence did to them, and they feel a very strong duty to combat that. Or maybe it's because they want to exercise violence in a mechanism that is legally sanctioned, whatever it happens to be. What you might then say is basically like, look, their argument is reliant on a characterization that just isn't true. Last example, this house supports a trend of basically like long-term romantic partners living at separate addresses. Gov says this decreases abuse. This argument presumes that the type of relationships that are engaging in this trend of living apart are relationships that have these very intense or very problematic power dynamics. But maybe what you can say is that this is not the realistic characterization. And in fact, this argument beats itself. If you're an abuser, the unfortunate reality very well be you're not going to ever allow your partner to enter into this type of relationship because perhaps of the fact that you would prefer to be in a more traditional relationship, i.e. living in the same house that gives you a greater proximity for abuse, etc. And therefore, that's why the argument fails. Fifth thing, choreographing victory. Have any of you ever seen the show Glee? I started watching, I don't watch television that much. I don't know television, but I watched an episode of Glee the other day, and I think Glee is about choreography. Is that kind of about choreography? They like choreograph stuff, don't they? I don't know. I'm not a TV person, but it seems like a fun show. Yes, they do. Oh, that's cool. I started watching it. I watched one episode. Anyways. What I basically mean when I say choreographing victorious refutation is like every time you respond to an argument, you want to basically explain why you also outweigh their argument. And what I mean by that is rebut the argument enough that the argument is like a little shaky. It's like a Jenga tower after you've pulled out like 3 or 4 blocks, and then demolish that that sucker with some good old weighing. So every time you refute an argument, choreograph your victory to be a beautiful dance by coupling refutation with weighing. I'm going to talk about this more in a second, so I'll hold off on talking about weighing, but TLDR, do it. It's fun. Last, I am skeptical of this, but I will tell you because this is a good thing to talk about. A lot of people, and oh God, do I have to keep slandering Americans? I'm so sorry, Americans. I'm so sorry, but I'm not sorry because I'm an American, so I can use the American card. Us Americans, we Americans, there's a lot of things that are bad about us Americans. For one thing, we have an unhealthy obsession with French fries. They're not that good, guys. They're not that good. Like, I don't know why we're all obsessed with them. They're like not that amazing. The second thing that we have an unhealthy obsession with is like just being like, their argument didn't prove this thing. And whenever debaters do that, it's fine, especially if you're right. But like, it sounds like kind of like that thing like whiny like little toddlers do. Like, he stole my toy, I'm gonna back. And it's like, yeah, he did. But like, go take your like effing toy or whatever. Like, I don't know, like not to be all like weird, like tough parenting. But like, oftentimes when people say that the argument that your opponents made is like, oh, they didn't prove this, they did, or a judge might interpret they did prove it. So in general, pointing out what the other team has to prove is fine. And even pointing out where mechanisms were missing, also fine. But in general, respond to the best possible iteration of an argument. Okay. 2 final things before we get to Kahoot. These 2 are both shorter, so don't worry, folks. We're going to have time for Kahooting. Are you guys so sad that I haven't gotten to Kahoot? Probably. I did warn you, in all fairness, in the email that this would go until probably 9:15. So the question now basically is, can we cram like actually like an enormous amount of material into like what slide are we at? Okay, we have like 50 more slides, folks. We can squeeze that in 15 minutes. Yeah, we can do it, guys. We can do it. Come on, guys, we can do it. Okay. Refutation structure. I don't have a ton to say here because I've covered most of this, but TLDR, I think that refuting an argument should have 6 big steps. Most of these are very self-explanatory. First, identify what argument are you responding to. Second, summarize. What did that argument say? Don't go on a 45-second rant. Okay, well, Judge, their first argument here, let me see. Oh, so Judge, their first argument had the following 6 mechanisms. Their first mechanism was, and then you like spend 10 seconds, and their second mechanism, 10 seconds there. And then it's like, summarize their argument like big picture, but don't be like crazy, like, oh my God, like their argument was so good. Like, don't sound like a simp for their argument. Sound like a skeptical onlooker watching a rom-com depicting that relationship. Then it can be good to do all the things I was talking about: direct responses, mitigation, flipping against an argument, the weighing and stuff like that. But the last thing I want to highlight, and the thing I want to talk about, is identifying the function of rebuttal. What I mean by that, especially in BP, where a bunch of arguments get thrown around, it's really easy to get lost in the nitty-gritty line by line. Judges don't often vote on very nitty-gritty line by line. They tend to vote on the bigger picture. And what that means is that it's very helpful to conclude rebuttal with a very clear narrative. This house would break up large banks. Op says we shouldn't do that because large banks act as economies of scale, and that's fucking fantastic. You run 4 responses. Okay, great, good job. Pat yourself on the back. Eat a sweet tonight because you deserve it. But remember to tell the judge what the takeaway is. And maybe you say something like this: the conclusion of our rebuttal is quite simple. The gov benefit, or I guess this is actually the op benefit, oops. The op benefit here about economies of scale is either just wrong or very, very marginal, which means that all of their arguments are either a win for us because inefficiencies exist the larger an institution gets. But even if they don't, in terms of weighing, our argument on, say, recessions outweighs this argument, given how non-comparative or unimpactful their argument is. So coupling these line by line dense responses with big picture, the conclusion of this analysis, the conclusion of this rebuttal is really helpful for driving home that big picture. Okay, miscellaneous stuff on refutation. Whenever you listen to arguments, I think it's good to listen through the argument until you have a really good grasp on exactly what they're arguing before you respond to it. This is something I'm bad at, so don't listen to me on this, or don't do what I do. Like, a lot of people will hear the tagline, they'll hear like, argument number 1, recessions. Let me come up with a bunch of responses to recessions. Like, listen to the argument so that you understand the nuance before you start figuring out your 10 bazillion responses. Second of all, respond to the best possible version of an argument, or at least a better-ish version of an argument. This is a GIF that has 2 + 2 = 3, to be clear. Weird, you can't see it. But like, you never know whether a judge is going to fully credit or undercredit an argument, so defer towards the side of erring on the side of caution. Third, if you're a second speaker, like, if you know what your partner is going to say, listen to them, but also make sure that you can use their speech as a time to kind of, either generate responses to things that have already been said or things that you expect to be said. And lastly, arguments very frequently repeat themselves. And what I mean by that is a lot of teams might make 3 arguments, but within those 3 arguments, there's like one common mechanism that repeats itself 4 times. In that instance, don't respond with the same response 4 times. Flag at maybe, for example, the first time that mechanism is used. This argument is a consistent theme throughout the gov case. I have 3 responses: response 1, response 2, response 3. And then subsequently later on, explicitly note where you can cross-apply responses. Judge, I've already responded to this argument. Your Honor, don't say Your Honor. That's so horrible. Why did I say that? Oh, now I've got the cooties because I said Your Honor, and that's creepy. Anyways, like, don't be overly repetitive with your responses to the extent that you can. If you have a common response to their case, put it at the top as opposed to like whatever, saying in a bunch of things. Okay, folks, that's refutation for you. I know, so fast, so quick, so sneaky. Questions that folks have on refutation or anything you want to say in regards to that generally big picture? Gorgeous. All right, final thing, weighing. As a quick note, folks, this section of the presentation is going to be a little bit rushed. I have an 1.5-hour long video that by the way, I haven't sent the notes yet. I need to finish typing up some things, so I'll send the notes out to you in the email tomorrow, probably tomorrow evening, realistically. But I have a lot of other resources on weighing that you can consult. This is meant to give you a big picture. And what I want to flag about weighing before we get into it is that weighing is something that you only really learn through experience. Same thing with refutations and argument construction, but especially weighing. Like, weighing is just something that is uncomfortable by nature. It's scary when you do it, and it's scary while you're doing it, and it's scary after you do it. And it's something that the best way to get better at it is just to do it, and to do it a lot in rounds and tournaments. So the stuff I'm going to tell you is very abstract. Whenever you're listening to arguments, I think you should always be asking yourself 2 questions. 1, how do I refute this argument using all the tactics I talked about before? And second, how do I outweigh this argument? Consciously thinking of the kind of like weighing metric you want to employ when beating an argument, fantastic thing. And that just means TLDR, you can't really learn weighing, you just have to do it, and that's how you get better at it. But what is weighing? Basically, weighing is an argument, just like any other argument, which means it needs to be justified and it needs to be illustrated. And that also means weighing needs to be analyzed, and it can also be contested by the other team. And at the end of the day, all that a weighing argument is an explanation for why X matters more than Y. But in order to explain why X matters more than Y, you need to use some common metric to compare those 2 arguments. Apples versus bananas don't make no sense unless you're going to compare something that apples and bananas, have in common, or some common ground like taste or color or beauty, or how effective they are to use as a form of weaponry against evil neighbors. Before I talk about what those metrics are, there's 2 meta comments I'm going to make on weighing. The first is that not all debates feature the same type of weighing. In some debates, teams will be striving for the same impact. So for example, I switched the slide order. In some debates, you're going to be striving for the same impact. So think about this house supports this environmental policy over that environmental policy. Both teams want the same impact, which is stopping climate change or whatever, saving the pandas, saving the kangaroos, saving the polar bears. God, save the polar bears, whatever. Why did I want to say save the children? We should all say save the polar bears. It's so much funnier that way and also cuter. Maybe children are cuter. I don't know. I'm a big sucker for polar bears and koalas. Koalas are very sweet. You should all love koalas. What's the opposite of F in chat? W in chat? Is there an opposite of F in chat? I know it's like from that Call of Duty game or whatever, but anyways, I was going to say put a W in chat for pandas, but that seems inappropriate. Anyways, do it. Put a W in chat for pandas because we love you pandas. Anyways, the gist is, if you're, for example, in a social justice debate, if you, for example, are in a, thank you, folks, thank you. If you're in a debate where you're like striving to get a good environmental benefit, you're kind of both weighing towards the same impact. Or if you're in a social justice debate, you're both weighing towards, on what side do we better protect minorities? And you're just weighing on which team is more likely to get that impact. So it's kind of a waste of your time to spend a bunch of time being like, but think about the polar bears. If both teams are trying to save the polar bears, focus on weighing why you're more likely to save the polar bears. Sometimes, though, you actually are weighing discrete different impacts against each other. That's where it's very helpful to actually do this explicit external weigh up. The other type of weighing, though, that is involved is like sometimes you'll weigh individual arguments against each other. Argument number 1 from our side beats argument number 3 from their side. But sometimes you'll also want to do macro scale weighing, where you want to explain, Judge, why is this argument from our side better than any other argument in this debate? I'm going to talk about the idea of logically prior weighing at the end of this as a best example of that. But TLDR, whenever one impact that you've identified necessarily short circuits the rest of the debate, in other words, nothing else matters except that impact, you can weigh around that heavily. So for example, the North Korea debate we talked about earlier, this house would have made North Korea. If you're op, if you can prove the invasion fails, the debate is over. It's done. You win automatically. There's no possible Gov ballot, most likely, on a failed invasion. If nothing else, op just wins on collateral damage and people dying in war. So if you're op in that debate, you could say our first argument on the failure of this invasion independently is a ballot for op. Even if Gov proves every single other impact on the debate up and down the flow, it doesn't matter, because the literal whole point of our argument is that the invasion happens, it fails, Kim Jong-un stays in power, oppression continues. The difference is people die and there's probably other ancillary harms. Before I talk about weighing, I'm going to keep you in suspense for a little bit more. Where do you put weighing? I think that you put it in 4 places. Any speech and prep time. In prep time, think about how you want to weigh your arguments, because that's a really good thing to do and will help you out a lot. Think about within first speeches, concluding arguments with that idea of framing. This argument should be weighed heavily because. In terms of weighing, this argument is important because. But also putting weighing into even second speeches is fantastic. Why? Because no one does it. And if you're the one person to do it, special star for you. Like Anyone play? I played it once, like that Mario Kart game where you get like the bullet bill or something and you like take off. You're like that. Lastly, obviously reply/rebuttal speeches. I think it's a great idea if you can to start these speeches with like, we independently win this debate for X reason, but if you can't do that, then that's fine. Okay, so, you know those like sappy life quotes that people put on their front doors, like, life happens the sooner you start focusing on what matters to the heart. Weighing is like that, but not stupid like that. 6 weighing strategies. I really messed up time prioritization and spent a lot more time prepping 1, 2, and 3 than 4, 5, and 6, even though you all know 1, 2, and 3, but don't know 4, 5, and 6 as much. Magnitude. If an argument affects more people or has a larger scale or a more intense impact, we say that that argument outweighs the other impact on magnitude. I'm going to skip that example. Very weird, complicated. You know what? If you want to read those examples, come back and read them after. But for the sake of time, I'm going to just assume that people feel okay-ish with magnitude weighing. The one thing I do want to flag about weighing on scale or weighing on magnitude is just that you don't need to weigh on, oh, our impact affects more people, therefore we win, because the intensity of impact matters. This house regrets the glorification of hard work. Gov says this is a bad narrative because it means that the poor get weaponized by conservatives, and that often results in things like welfare funding being slashed, right? If op's like, oh, but the glorification of hard work means that everyone in society works harder than we glorify them and they feel happy. Maybe it's true that op's impact here affects more people numerically, but the intensity of Gov's impact is much greater, and therefore Gov would outweigh op. This house wouldn't allow out-of-court settlements for workplace discrimination/harassment. If you're on Gov on this motion, right, maybe you say, well, when we ban this, we're going to protect future victims, people who haven't yet been victimized, but could be in the future and would not be if we let victims come forward and speak. Maybe op says, well, banning settlements is bad because people who've already been abused now can't reap monetary benefits. Maybe Gov says our argument is more important because the intensity of benefit that we can provide from preventing a harm is greater than the intensity of benefit that we can provide by mitigating a harm. Wait, I skipped one. Oh yeah, weighing on probability. If you can prove an argument is more likely to be true, it outweighs other arguments. This is a really good thing to do on the idea of internal weighing, where both teams are striving for the same impact. Number 2 is very funky. I talk about it in a different video. Feel free to watch that in case you're curious. It's very fun, but weird. This house believes indigenous communities in the Amazon should undertake vigilante actions against poachers. Gov says, well, now if I'm a logging company, I don't want to go to your indigenous communities because I'm going to get shot, and that's bad for me. Op's like, Bolsonaro's going to win office in 2022. Presumably, it's really hard to change the entire electoral scheme of Brazil. Probably easier to change the incentive of a single logging company. Gov outweighs op on probability. This house supports the actions of like vigilante feminist violent groups. Gov is like, well, maybe we're not going to change all of India, but at least the benefit of these groups, which we know for near certainty, is that the people who are in the Gulabi gang really like it and find it very cathartic and empowering. Op's like, but backlash, right? Backlash might happen, but it's also not super certain whether or not this is going to be the tipping point for like swinging elections. But we're like really hella certain that there's a bunch of women in India who find a lot of meaning in what they do in the Gulabi gang. Our argument outweighs theirs on certainty. Time frame weighing. All right, guys, there's like literally 2 ways this generally comes up. Number 1 is like the like transition argument, like, but when we do this motion, there's going to be like bad things happen, but then it like gets fixed in the long term, right? Like this house would ban private schools. Gov's like, oh no, the private school is being banned. The public system gets over flooded, like whatever. Like it doesn't matter because op can be like, but we reduce inequality in the long term. It doesn't matter in the short term. There's a harm. It gets fixed eventually. The other thing before I chat about vulnerability is the other common example of long-term weighing is, anyone want to guess what impact is most commonly weighed on long-termism? Anyone want to guess? Anyone want to guess? Anyone want to guess? Anyone? Yeah, Emily, you got it. Climate change. Everyone loves to weigh it like climate. It's like the classic, their impact only lasts for 5 years, but our impact lasts for 500,000 years because climate change affects everything. Weighing on vulnerability, I think that this is underutilized in America and overutilized in Canada, not because it's unimportant to talk about vulnerable groups, but because very oftentimes the weighing that teams do on vulnerable groups is like obviously going to just be contested by other teams in terms of other teams saying, yeah, but we better benefit that group. So whenever you talk about impacts, it's useful to talk about the group that is affected by an impact. So if you, for example, have a motion like this house regrets the creation of cryptocurrency, excuse-moi, Maybe Gov says cryptocurrencies are bad because they're volatile. And that means that when random people buy these things as financial assets, they lose value during shocks and therefore they lose money. But maybe Op says cryptocurrencies are, this is one of the best arguments for cryptocurrencies, FYI, is that cryptocurrencies allow for a global flow of remittances with fewer transaction costs because you don't have to transact between different currencies. And that means that really poor communities, especially in the global south that don't have access to conventional bank accounts but can access cryptocurrency, are able to access more amounts of money inflowing in the form of remittances. On average, transaction costs are 8% lower with cryptocurrencies, right? If you're Op on this motion, you might be like, our argument outweighs theirs, because maybe it is true cryptocurrencies are volatile and therefore the like random dudes on like Reddit who buy a bunch of cryptocurrency and then cryptocurrency fails, maybe they lose money. But the sort of dude who has like 500K casually sitting around in like his like Robinhood account is like fine, even if they like go bankrupt. Like not fine, but like they're better off compared to like a really poor community in like rural Ecuador that gets inflows of remittances and benefits enormously from that. This house believes Catholic officials in Mexico shouldn't make political statements, right? Gov maybe says this is bad for poor individuals in Mexico who under status quo have a lot of bad policies imposed upon them because of the massive political clout of people like priests, for instance. Op is like, but these priests love it. They're so happy when they talk about politics. Maybe if you're Gov, you're like, look, we don't give a shit about priests. We give a shit about poor people in Mexico who need better welfare policies, and that's what we better get under our side. Before I chat about reversibility, I want to just quickly summarize the weighing on vulnerability idea. If you are picking between two different groups to prioritize, you can prioritize vulnerable groups, both because we have moral reparative duties to them and because the marginal utility they derive from benefit is vastly greater in proportion and scale compared to the benefits that wealthier, more privileged groups get. That being said, one quick caveat, the fact that a privileged group benefits doesn't necessarily mean that poorer groups don't. So for example, one of my least favorite arguments in debate is like people who are like, oh, this benefits the, like economic growth only benefits the rich. Like it's true that the economic growth disproportionately benefits the rich, but like, it's not clear if people care more about the fact that Jeff Bezos got $100 billion richer or if they themselves got richer, even if it wasn't by as much. Like at the end of the day, economic growth probably is a good thing, even if it's distributed unequally. We would rather have everyone be richer as opposed to having perhaps more equal society. That's an argument, of course, but just like a personal opinion I happen to have that is like, make sure that you actually prove a unique benefit or harm to a vulnerable group as opposed to just proving inequality. Reversibility. Once impacts have happened, sometimes they're easy to stop, sometimes they're hard to stop. Recessions, for example, can be very hard to stop. Like once runaway inflation starts, really hard to stop it. Some other impacts are pretty easy to reverse. So for example, this house would implement open borders. Maybe Op says backlash. Maybe Gov says backlash is actually quite reversible because as a bunch of immigrants enter the United States, you get social contact. So you have people establishing connections, talking with neighbors, establishing bonds, which eventually ends up meaning that you break down racist stereotypes, you limit things like backlash. Their argument is heavily reversible, but for example, people dying as they try to cross the Mediterranean to get to Europe, that's not reversible. So the idea with weighing on reversibility is which impact is harder for us to otherwise stop? Which impact is the least able to be mitigated? Because that's where the priority should be. So let's say you had a motion like this house would nationalize Wall Street, right? This is not an example of reversibility weighing, but it's the intuition I want you to use, right? If Op's like, we should regulate Wall Street, and Gov's like, we kind of could regulate Wall Street, but like, that's not going to work because private Wall Street always going to lobby against regulations, right? That would be an example of kind of implicitly doing some reversibility weighing, right? The problem with Op's counterprop is that at the end of the day, it's quite reversible. Our impact is much less reversible, right? But think about other impacts of this, right? For example, one of the most common things that you can do, I guess, this kind of brings me nicely to like the logically prior weighing, so it's fine, we'll do this. The idea is, I think you can always conceptualize of impacts kind of like a river, right? And this gets back to the burden idea from before. If you think of arguments as being a river, right? If you block the river up top, water never gets to the bottom. And this is why you'll hear a lot of university debaters say things like, our impacts are upstream of theirs. Our impacts are logically prior to theirs. And this is kind of like the argument I mentioned before about invading North Korea. If Op proves the invasion fails, that argument is upstream of everything else. every single other debate in the impact, every single other impact in the debate is contingent on this invasion succeeding. So if you imagine kind of like a river of sorts, if gov doesn't prove efficacy, we never go down any further down the river because we stopped at the first rock, which was op proving that the invasion fails. So if op can prove that this invasion doesn't work, the debate automatically is over, right? You've already basically won more or less. Yeah, this is the same thing as prerequisite weighing, Julian. So the idea basically is like, if you can prove that something is a prerequisite to something else that's logically prior to something else, you basically can win the debate right there. So this is the idea of if one argument is, if other arguments are contingent on something, if that contingency is proven or disproven, that basically means that you win the debate. There's three really common examples of this: principles, social justice, and preserving life. Preserving life is by far the easiest example of this. Guys, how happy are dead people?
Not happy.
Yes, not happy. Now, they might not be sad, but they're not happy because they can't be happy and they can't be sad. So any impact about human happiness is actually contingent on people being alive. And so you can often make arguments that say the biggest priority in this debate should be protecting human life, because every other impact that we could possibly talk about is logically contingent on people being alive. If people are dead, they don't feel very many things, and therefore the prerequisite to the rest of this debate is people being alive. Therefore, weigh lives above anything else. But two other common examples of this: principles and social justice. Principles. This house supports torture in the fight against terrorism. This house supports the use of torture, right? If op proves that this is inherently immoral, the debate stops. Not actually, but it should. Because if op can prove that torture is inherently a wrong thing to do, it don't even matter not one bit that torture is good or bad, because it's inherently wrong, it's inherently immoral. Flag on the play, stop, red button, done. Because if you can prove that something is inherently wrong, the debate is over. Well, if you actually weigh it correctly. So the weighing that you can do on morality is actions are governed by their moral status. Even if something would be a good thing to do, it is contingent on it being a morally fine thing to do. The world would be a better place if we took the 50 smartest people in the world, locked them in a laboratory, and said, you are going to work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, 360,000 days a year to develop groundbreaking inventions for society. The world would be a better place if we did that, but we don't do that because it's immoral. And that indicates that we care more about the moral status of actions than their strict consequential outcomes. More on this coming in week 8 when we chat about moral philosophy. Other example, social justice rounds. In every single social justice debate you are ever in, here's a really interesting way to weigh things. Any motion about this house believes that X movement should embrace this advocacy, the impacts don't matter at all. In fact, there's no impact if activists don't feel invigorated, don't feel connected, don't feel engaged. Because no social advocacy strategy, no narrative will ever be persuasive if it's not pushed hard, if there aren't people talking about it on social media, if there aren't people talking about it at protests, talking about it in interviews. So what you can oftentimes do in terms of weighing is to say the most important impact in these types of debates is the impact on engagement with the movement. If people don't feel really, really intensely like they want to do something good for the movement, nothing else matters. You're never going to get any change because no one shows up to your protests. No one shows up to do your interviews or doesn't do them well. So you can oftentimes say that making people feel like they really need to be working for the movement, engaging with the movement, is often the logically prior impact to anything else. Because the biggest impact in any social justice debate, you can often say, is getting any sort of change. But any sort of change based on any sort of advocacy strategy is almost always dependent on having activists feel sufficiently engaged with the movement. So that is basically more or less the concept here of logically prior or prerequisite weighing. If we don't have engaged activists, we never get any of the other benefits. This is the rock in the river. If you take away that rock, nothing else moves. Because if you don't have engaged activists, no other impact in the debate will possibly stand. So that was quite a lot of random weighing stuff. Questions that folks have, I'm sure that there are things there that don't make a ton of sense, / are weird, / confusing, / strange. General question that I got is like, to what extent does that specific motion stop engaged activists? Like, you might just kind of be like, on that motion, which was like, it's called impact litigation. It's basically where you sue people a bunch to try to get like, basically it's where you sue people to try to get like change in the courts. On either side, you can make arguments about engagement, right? Like on one side, you could be like, maybe this is a really, really effective way of going about kind of creating change, because you're able to get, people buying into the movement, feeling like things matter, stuff like that. There's an endpoint, people feel connected, blah, blah, blah. Maybe on the other side, you say this doesn't feel significant, this doesn't feel meaningful. It feels like people are working towards this like very bureaucratic or legislatively obnoxious system, so people check out of the movement, et cetera. That's just an example of how you might talk about, engaged activists in that motion. Other question is there a way to weigh against weighing? That's a lot of ways to weigh against weighing. Yeah. So oftentimes what you can say, so the general rough thing that we talk about in terms of weighing, imagine if you could quantify impacts. Not that you can, but like if you could quantify impacts, you could kind of quantify them by like magnitude of impact multiplied by its likelihood multiplied by its longevity, right? Almost always you can try to weigh one of those three things as being most important, right? So for example, let's say the other team, says something like, the other team is like, our argument outweighs your argument because our argument is really likely to be true. Well, you might say, it doesn't matter that it's really likely to be true, because even if our argument is slightly less probable or slightly less certain, it's also way more important, right? And the fact that your argument is guaranteed to be true doesn't make it more significant, because both of our arguments have a possible way of being true, but ours is just simply way more impactful, way more significant. And therefore, we should care more about the severity of impact as opposed to the certainty of impact. Both of our impacts have a probability of happening. Yours is marginally higher, but the scale of my impact is much greater. So the change in terms of probability is small, change in terms of magnitude is larger. Maybe you're weighing on time frame, right? You can 100% weigh short time frame arguments as being more important. Maybe you say something like, for example, they say, our argument only applies in the short run, but maybe you, for example, say it doesn't matter because what happens now affects the future. So for example, maybe giving more schooling to the people of today is a short-term impact, but it has long-term impacts, right? And therefore you can say we win even under their weighing metric. You can also say things though, like, look, maybe it's true that their impact is a long-term impact, but it's really small. So yeah, you affect people for 50 years, but you affect them very minimally. We would rather impact people really, really intensely now. Other quick note on weighing on time frame. Weighing on time frame 9 times out of 10 is basically just weighing on magnitude without actually saying weighing on magnitude. Like, think about it, guys. Why do we care about something being long term in general? Like, someone help me out. Why do we care about something being long term? Why does that matter? Like, in general, big picture. Like, why do we care about something happening for a long amount of time? Anyone?
Because more good can be done if it lasts longer.
Yeah. Almost every time frame argument is implicitly a magnitude argument. Implicitly, when you're saying this impact exists for a long amount of time, what you're really, really, really just implicitly saying is what? You're implicitly just saying that our argument affects a bigger group of people. That's it. That's implicitly what you're saying, right? So if you can kind of be like, look, your argument might be long-term, but our argument, just it has a greater intensity of impact. We don't care about the fact that you have a longer-term impact. All that you really are saying here is that we want to impact a lot of people. We impact people more intensely, and that's more important. Another question I got, what's the difference between characterization and framing? Look, guys, I'm gonna be honest, people use the phrases interchangeably. When I say characterization, what I basically mean is, what are the neutral characteristics of people involved in the debate? To be clear, you can spar over characterization. So let me give you an example. North Korea. Is it possible that someone could make an argument that Kim Jong-un is an irrational actor? Is it possible that someone can make that argument? Not a trick question. Yes, definitely. Like TLDR, 100%. Like, someone could definitely make the argument that says Kim Jong-un is an irrational actor. It's also possible for you to make an argument that Kim Jong-un is a rational actor, right? Those two are both possible characterizations. You can debate over them. But one thing you're going to notice is that the fact that Kim Jong-un is proven to be rational or irrational does not immediately auto-win you the debate, right? It just proves something, but it doesn't prove an argument. It just proves a characterization, a premise, if you will. So the difference, so characterization is kind of like neutral, like setup, like what are the interests, backgrounds, contexts of the people involved in the debate. Framing is an explanation of why an argument matters. Why do we care about this argument in the debate? Why should this argument be weighed heavily? Why do we care about the impact, if you will? Oh, TLDR, too long, didn't read. Long, it's like a weird Reddit way of saying long story short, like the Taylor Swift song. Basically is the gist. TLDR means too long, didn't read. I think so, anyways. So yeah. Anyways, I should have clarified that. Do I use any of the weird acronyms? I don't know. I do hashtag a lot. That's not an acronym though, I don't think. Is SLAY an acronym? Does SLAY stand for something? I don't think so. That's so sad. It would be so funny if it did. We should come up with a debate acronym for SLAY. Statement, link. What's a word that is similar to explanation or like warrant or mechanism that starts with an A? Articulation. And then Y is can anyone think of a word for like impact that starts with Y? Yeah, I can't. I don't know. Why do we care? Yassification. Yeah, anyways. Yeah, that's it. We'll do yassification. So statement, link, articulation, yassification. Thank you, Emily. Anyways, I got very super long arguments. Oh, wait, oops, I missed some. Yeah, super long argument. Yes, that's good. Those are all good. Anyways, sorry, I missed some other ones. That was a very long-winded way of saying framing is explaining why an argument matters. Characterization is describing the like neutral characteristics of groups involved in the debate, if that kind of makes sense. Okay, any other questions that folks want to ask before we move to the Kahoot? Okay, cool. So I'll stop recording. Bye, recording people. Everyone say bye, recording people. Come on, say bye.
Bye, recording people.